The solemnity of the most holy body and blood of Christ, which we celebrate today, has a history. So we go back into the 13th century to Belgium, to a young girl named Giuliani, who we now revere as a saint. From the time she was 16 years old, she began to receive mystical visions and revelations from Jesus Christ. And when she had entered the convent and became an Augustinian nun, the Lord indicated to her that he was going to give her the task of promoting and seeing to it that the church would celebrate on one particular day with particular solemnity the sacrament of his body and blood. On account of this, she suffered greatly. She was able to convince her bishop to institute the feast. And what turned out is that, in a way only providence could bring about, that while the feast was not gaining much traction, her bishop was eventually elected to the chair of Peter and took the name Urban IV and instituted the solemnity as a universal feast of the church 6 years after her death. There is kind of an interesting parallel even in our more recent history in the church. So we go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, more particularly the early 20th century, and there we find a Polish nun, Saint Faustina. And she too received an abundance of mystical experiences and revelations from Jesus Christ, and he indicated to her that he was going to give her the task of promoting and seeing to it that there be a feast instituted in the church that honored his mercy. And she suffered greatly on account of it. While the devotion to the divine mercy did have some traction in Poland, after St. Faustina's death, it seemed like all of her work died with it. Until once again, you have a situation that can only be brought about by providence, is that there would be a bishop from Poland, the Archbishop of Krakow, who would be elevated to the chair of Peter and take the name Pope John Paul II, and would reopen the investigation into her revelations and what it was the Lord had instructed her, and then instituted the Feast of the Divine Mercy that we celebrate each year, 8 days after Easter, on the octave day of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. The feast itself is over 700 years. And when Pope Urban IV instituted this feast of Corpus Christi, he asked then St. Thomas Aquinas, who had a tremendous devotion to the Holy Eucharist, to write the texts for this Mass and for the celebration of the divine office. And so if you looked at the credits, you would see that today's opening hymn and our closing hymn are the very hymns that St. Thomas Aquinas wrote and composed for this feast day, and has been sung by the faithful for 700 years. But let's get to the sacrament of Christ's body and blood. And I'm not going to go into any big theological explanations or talk about transubstantiation, all these things that are all very good and true. And I think they're all things that we ought to know. But to look more briefly, just simply, at what the sacrament itself is and what it is that it signifies. And it is a sacrament of God's love. Pure and simple. We don't need to overcomplicate it, as we sometimes tend to overcomplicate things. But we look at the occasion Jesus Christ chose to institute the sacrament. During the course of the Last Supper, on the occasion of the Passover of the Jews, the night before he himself would offer his life and be sacrificed for the salvation of the world. And so taking bread, he said, "This is my body, which will be given up for you." We all know St. Thomas Aquinas has taught us that love is to will the good of the other. St. Pope John Paul II would elaborate upon that and say further that love is to make a sincere gift of ourself for the sake of another person. And there is no more sincere or more greater gift that Christ could give us than his very self, his very body. This is my body, which will be given up for you. And with a chalice filled with wine, he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant." You know, and what is a covenant? You know, a covenant is not a contract. You know, if you need some work done in your house, say there's some bad plumbing, you call a plumber, he looks at the job that needs to be done, and he offers you a proposal. And that proposal has a dollar amount. You can either accept or reject it. It's a transaction. It's a business transaction. A covenant is not a business transaction. It is an exchange of persons. That is why it is more proper to speak of the sacrament of holy matrimony as a covenantal relationship. Because in the exchange in vows, a man and a woman commit themselves, and yes, their bodies, to each other. There is a very real way, without exaggeration, that during the celebration of holy matrimony, as a man and woman are exchanging their vows, that they are saying, much like what Christ said the night before he died, "This is my body, which I promise to give up for you. This is my body. Take it as a sincere gift of myself for your sake." It's an exchange of persons. And so Christ takes the chalice filled with wine and says, "This is my blood of the covenant. It will be poured out for many." We see nothing in this sacrament except divine love. even in the elements Christ chose. Proclaim love and the suffering with which that gift was given to us. Because we all know bread doesn't grow on stalks. We don't pick it from trees. Grain is harvested. That grain is sifted. That grain is ground by a millstone in Jesus' time. Is ground by a millstone and then baked with intense fire. And even wine itself, to begin that process, grapes must be plucked, put into a wine press, and crushed until nothing else comes out. So even the elements themselves of the bread and the wine proclaim sacrifice and the willingness of Christ to offer himself for our salvation, to will our good, to give us his body, to make of himself a sincere and total gift for ourselves. Now, I'd mentioned this a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to ask it again on this occasion. How often do we come forward to receive the Holy Eucharist, and if we could actually hear the sound of the Holy Eucharist coming into our heart, does it sound like a quarter being dropped into an empty coffee can? I think it's a fair question. Because we all have our own particular struggles and trials. We all suffer in one way or another. It is always faith that brings us back to this place, even if it's a very weak faith, but we still come. But what also must come is the time when we open our eyes and recognize the gift and receive it precisely as that. If you struggle with faith that Jesus Christ is truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, under the appearance of bread and wine, well, God already knows. So talk to him about it. Talk to him about it. How often do you think the disciples asked Jesus Christ, as he's revealing divine mysteries, to increase their faith? We're only told of one occasion, but there's nothing to suggest it was the only occasion when Christ said and revealed things that were incomprehensible to us. How many times, have the disciples listened to Jesus Christ, teaching the crowds, and he's using parables. And even the disciples themselves didn't understand the parables, and when they would return home, they would question him about what he said, and Christ would explain it to them so that they could understand. And so if your faith is weak, or if it's non-existent, in the reality, of the substance of the Holy Eucharist, then you need to ask Jesus Christ for that faith. And if the Holy Eucharist, is not bearing fruit in your life, then you need to receive it with greater love It's a gift. I mean, how rude and socially unacceptable is it, when someone gives you a gift? I mean, even on an occasion when you would expect it. You would maybe expect something at Christmas time, or you would expect something for your birthday. Well, just because it's expected doesn't mean a lack of gratitude is appropriate. And even if you ask somebody for a gift, that doesn't make a lack of gratitude acceptable. A gift is always a gift. And the gift always needs to be returned with gratitude. And in the case of the Holy Eucharist, the only return that is acceptable, is not simply our gratitude, but is love. To receive the sacrament with love in return for the gift of love that we receive.